On the 26th of May 1650, a son was born into the Churchill family at Ash House in the county of Devon, England. The boy was named John, and his parents were Sir Winston Churchill and Elizabeth Drake. Indeed, the Churchill family is said to have originated in the county of Devon as far back as the 1100s in the reign of Henry II. Sir Winston had fought for the Royalists in the English Civil War and had subsequently been forced by Parliament to pay a compound or fine to recover his property after the conflict. Parliament had confiscated the estates and property of Royalists, so that after hostilities had ceased, they were then forced to pay the fine and pledge never to take up arms against Parliament ever again. The English Civil War was in essence a power struggle between the English Parliament and King Charles I between 1642 and 1651. Charles was eventually defeated and then tried for high treason and publicly beheaded. He was then replaced by a military-led government under the puritanical parliamentarian Oliver Cromwell, who swiftly proved himself to be an even more tyrannical ruler than the king he deposed. Indeed, when one looks at almost every other regicide and revolution in European history where a monarch is deposed, the government that replaced them was often 10 times more tyrannical and brutal than the monarch it replaced. This can be seen first in England with Cromwell, in France in the late 18th century with Napoleon, and Russia in the early 20th century. England, however, was unique in Europe as it voluntarily re-adopted monarchy after Cromwell's death, as it was soon realised that a union between monarchy and Parliament would be a more effective and safe form of governance. Indeed, it could be said that the stability of England's constitutional monarchy in the coming decades was one of the foundations of England and later Britain coming to dominate Europe and the world through its empire. John Churchill's mother, Elizabeth Drake, and her family had supported the parliamentarian side during the English Civil War, and this had caused friction between her family and Sir Winston's family. But Winston and Elizabeth still had at least 9 children together, but only 5 of them survived infancy. Little is known about John's early years, but we do know that the Churchill family were not wealthy, which was at least down in parts to John's father's former allegiances to the Royalist cause. Indeed, John's most famous descendant, Winston Churchill, who wrote an epic biography of John's life, stated that he felt that the impoverished conditions in which John grew up might well have aroused in his mind 2 prevailing impressions: first, a hatred of poverty, and secondly, the need of hiding his thoughts and feelings from those to whom their expression would be repugnant. After the death of England's only Republican ruler, Oliver Cromwell, in 1658, the executed King Charles I's son, Charles II, was crowned monarch, thusly meaning that former royalists during the Civil War, such as Churchill's father Winston, enjoyed an increase in their fortunes. John then started school in Dublin after his father, who had become a Member of Parliament in 1661, was made a commissioner there, but he returned with his family soon afterwards to London after his father was recalled, and John was then educated at the St Paul's School in the city. Then, in 1665, John's sister Arabella was made Maid of Honour to Anne Hyde, who was the wife of James, Duke of York, King Charles II's brother. Indeed, James would become king himself after Charles's death, and Arabella's appointment would later prove crucial to John's advancement in life. Churchill then attended Oxford University, where he performed well by all accounts, learning philosophy, mathematics, classics, and also became fluent in French, Latin, Greek, and German. Indeed, the breadth and depth of John's education can be seen as a strong indication of his intelligence. Because of his sister's appointment, as previously mentioned, John became close to the Duke of York, and would often accompany James whilst inspecting troops in London. He then, in 1667, was granted a commission at the rank of ensign in the King's Own Company in the 1st Guards, which later became the Grenadier Guards. Then, John's good looks were noticed by one of the King's mistresses, Barbara Villiers, and the two started an affair. On one occasion, Churchill was discovered by King Charles II himself, hiding in a cupboard after he had been with Barbara. John, upon being discovered, sank to his knees and begged Charles for forgiveness. Charles said, "You are a rascal, but I forgive you, as you do it for your bread." John even went on to have a daughter with Barbara, but never acknowledged that she was his child. In 1672, John was posted to sea and was involved in the Battle of Sol Bay against the Dutch off the coast of Suffolk in eastern England. England at this time was an ally of France against the Dutch Republic, as the English Stuart monarchy still enjoyed close ties with Catholic France. Indeed, it would be these close ties with Catholic powers such as France that would be the undoing of the Stuart dynasty in England and result in William of Orange of the Dutch Republic being invited to invade England and claim the throne. After the Battle of Solbay, Churchill was promoted to captain and was then posted to the continent, serving with the French forces in the Siege of Maastricht in 1673, where he, according to accounts, saved the life of the Duke of Monmouth, earning the praise and recognition of the French King Louis XIV, who was John's future arch-rival. However, the anti-French English Parliament forced King Charles to withdraw from the war with the Dutch in 1674, but John remained attached to the French forces, serving in various battles, including Sinsheim and Ensheim. After returning from the war, Churchill, now a colonel, turned his attentions to Sarah Jennings, who, like John, was a member of a low-ranking aristocratic family, which had been on the royalist side during the Civil War. This meant that Sarah was thusly employed in the royal court as a maid of honour. John started to write to Sarah, expressing his love for her, and they were soon married in the winter of 1677. Sarah and John's fortunes would be forever tied, and she would come to play a crucial role in helping him secure greater favour in successive royal courts, and they would go on to have 7 children together during their lifetime. In 1678, the English Parliament was preparing to join forces with the Dutch Republic in their war against the French, much to Charles II's disapproval. Churchill was then sent to The Hague as part of an English delegation to organise the deployment of English forces during the war, and whilst there, Churchill met William of Orange, who was greatly impressed with John's abilities. However, an agreement proved elusive, partly down to Charles II taking part in his own negotiations with the French behind Parliament's back, and the Franco-Dutch War ended soon afterwards with the two sides agreeing the Treaty of Nijmegen in 1679. After returning home, Churchill found England to be in a state of political turmoil. A renegade Anglican priest named Titus Oates had caused uproar in the country by claiming that there was a Catholic plot to kill Charles II. As an anti-Catholic Anglican, Oates was determined that the Catholic James Duke of York should not succeed his brother to the throne, as King Charles did not have an heir. Oates's claims then led to 22 people being executed, and James Duke of York himself was exiled from the country. Eventually, Oates's fabrications were proven to be false, and he was subsequently convicted of perjury or lying under oath, and died in obscurity in 1705. After the crisis, which seriously threatened John's patron James, and thusly Churchill's own career, both John and Sarah then settled down to enjoy one of the quieter periods of their life together, as they now had a steady income which enabled them to buy several properties both in London and in St Albans in Hertfordshire. But this period of calm wasn't to last, as in 1685 Charles II died, meaning that the Catholic James Duke of York, now James II, was crowned king. This caused great anxiety and unrest in the Protestant population, as many feared the resurgence of the religious violence that had plagued England since Henry VIII had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s. This unrest led to Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, James Scott, the first Duke of Monmouth, to try and seize the throne for himself. He assembled an army on the continent and landed at Lyme Regis, West Dorset, on the 11th of June 1685, and started to recruit irregulars and farmers to his growing army, which eventually numbered in the region of 4,000 poorly trained and equipped troops. King James had received intelligence of the plot, and then sent a force of 3,000 regulars under the Earl of Feversham to confront Monmouth. John was effectively second in command, but due to Feversham's inexperience, the following battle was in the main orchestrated by Churchill. The two forces then met on the 6th of July 1685 near Bridgewater, Somerset. The peasant army at first attempted a night attack, but stumbled across a patrol of the king's forces, which quickly alerted the remainder of their army. Soon after this, the rebels melted under the pressure from the Royal Regulars' superior training, and they were then flanked by cavalry. The result of this was a rout, and Monmouth himself was captured whilst hiding dressed as a peasant. He was then taken to London and duly beheaded on Tower Hill on the 15th of July 1685. The two leaders of the government forces were then rewarded for their victory, Feversham being made a Knight of the Garter and Churchill being promoted to Major General. After the Battle of Sedge Moor, and the Monmouth Rebellion as it became known, Churchill's reputation was on the rise, but he was now keen to distance himself from King James, as the monarch was gradually promoting Catholics to positions within the royal court, thusly earning the suspicion of Protestants throughout the land. Indeed, Churchill told the king himself that he had been bred a Protestant and intended to die in that communion. Then the Queen, King James's wife Mary, who was an Italian Catholic herself, gave birth to a male heir, another James, making the concerned Protestants throughout England realise that a new Catholic Stuart dynasty was in the making. This sparked powerful Protestants into action, including many members of Parliament, and of course notable bishops within the Church of England. They then sent a letter of invitation to the Dutch stadtholder or stateholder, William of Orange, who was also married to King James II's eldest daughter Mary. Mary had been raised as a Protestant and had married William of Orange in 1677. Her mother Anne was the first wife of James II, but she had died in 1671, meaning that James then remarried the Catholic Mary of Modena in 1673, which made the possibility of the next monarch being Protestant more remote. Parliament's reasons for inviting William of Orange were not only down to him being the most powerful Protestant ruler in Europe, but were also down to the fact, as previously mentioned, that his wife Mary was the eldest Protestant child of James II and was thusly the rightful successor to James II in Parliament's eyes. Therefore, inviting both William and Mary to take the throne in essence meant that James's eldest child took the crown after him, and also meant that in her husband William, both Mary and England had the world's most powerful Protestant nation at the time, in the Dutch Republic, as an ally. With William and Mary's ascendancy to the throne, there would be no chance of a Catholic monarch ever again taking the crown. This made the invitation of William and Mary far too good an opportunity for Parliament to turn down, and the plans for the invasion went ahead. Churchill was not amongst the signatories of the invitation, but did assure William of his allegiance, which would, if the following invasion had failed, been an act of treason punishable by death. The invasion did not fail, however, and William quickly assembled a massive force of 40,000 troops, which then boarded a huge naval force of 463 ships, which was nearly twice the size of the Spanish Armada. William and his fleet then crossed the Channel and landed at Torbay in Devon on the 5th of November 1688. King James countered this by sending Lord Feversham with an army southwest, but many of his commanders were uneager to engage William's forces, many of them seeing the writing on the wall. Churchill then deserted King James. Taking 400 men, he rode out of the royal camp to meet and join with William's army. When the king learned that one of his most trusted and loyal supporters and friends had deserted him, he lost his nerve, and instead of choosing to fight William, the king fled to safety to Catholic France with his son, effectively surrendering the throne in the process. William of Orange was now King William III of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and had taken the throne from James without a single shot being fired. However, Parliament used the opportunity of William and Mary ascending to the throne to impose on them certain conditions. These resulted in the Bill of Rights, which led to certain limitations being placed on the monarch. These restricted the power of subsequent kings and queens and ensured that Parliament had to have free and fair elections, and that the monarch could not levy taxes without the consent of Parliament or maintain armies. This meant that the English Parliament now, once and for all, held the real power over the country, making the monarchy a constitutional one, rather than the absolute monarchy or effective dictatorship like that of Louis XIV's France. This period of William and Mary taking the throne and Parliament seizing the opportunity to once and for all limit royal power became known as the Glorious Revolution, and is one of the most important events in English and British history, as it was the point at which Britain started to become a democracy, and without it is doubtful that democratic government in the Western world would exist at all. As reward for him supporting William and Mary, Churchill was created the Earl of Marlborough in April 1689, and was also made a member of the Privy Council. John was then charged with remodelling and reorganising the army, which turned out to be fortuitous, as England was soon involved in the 9-year war against Louis XIV's France. John was then placed in charge of 8,000 British troops and sent to the continent in the spring of 1689. However, Churchill saw little action during the 9 Years' War, but did gain praise for his actions at the Battle of Walcourt, in which an Allied army defeated a smaller French force. After William III's victory at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland, in which he ended any hope James II had of regaining power, Churchill was deployed to Southern Ireland and distinguished himself there before returning to England shortly afterwards. An atmosphere of distrust had grown between the ambitious Marlborough and King William, because Churchill felt that he deserved higher recognition and complained about the king using foreign commanders in English armies. John's wife Sarah also formed a close relationship, some say intimate, with Queen Mary's sister, Princess Anne. Sarah Churchill's close friendship with Anne damaged both her and John's reputation within court, but it would come to pay dividends for them both after Mary and William's deaths in the coming years. Churchill had recently been in contact with James II in France, seeking to attain pardon from his old patron for his betrayal of him. Queen Mary then demanded that Sarah Churchill should be dismissed from Anne's service, but Anne refused, which outraged William and Mary, and they then ordered the Secretary of State to dispose Marlborough of all his offices of state, both military and civil, causing outrage and further resentment. Then, in the spring of 1692, reports of a letter came to light in which a number of signatories, including Marlborough, supposedly discussed the restoration of James II to the throne. Queen Mary subsequently had Marlborough arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, where he stayed for 5 weeks, but the letters condemning John were later found to be forgeries, and Churchill was subsequently released. Queen Mary then died in December of 1694, leading to a tentative reconciliation between William and Anne, who would now definitely be the next monarch after William. Churchill was allowed to return to court, but was not given employment or position, as King William still mistrusted him. Then, in 1700, the King of Spain, Charles II, died, leaving no heir. Charles left the Spanish throne and its massive empire to Louis XIV's grandson, Philip, making him Philip V of Spain. Charles II had stipulated that Philip taking the Spanish throne was on the condition that he also renounced any claim he had to the French throne, but Louis XIV rejected this, meaning that France would have control over Spain's huge empire, making it a world superpower that could potentially dominate the globe if unchallenged. A grand alliance was then formed against France, consisting of England, Austria, Brandenburg, the Dutch Republic and many others, with the aim of stopping the union of France and Spain. Then King William III of England died on the 8th of March 1702 from injuries he sustained during a riding accident, making Anne Queen of England, and Churchill was now placed in command of the English and Dutch armies on the continent. After a series of inconclusive confrontations between the French and the Allies, it became evident to Marlborough that the Austrians urgently needed assistance to stay in the war, as the French and their allies Bavaria were advancing towards Vienna, isolating the Austrians and potentially risking them being knocked out of the war altogether. Marlborough then resolved in 1704 to march to the aid of Austria, and over a 5-week march he brilliantly managed to outmaneuver the French who attempted to stop him, and his army then arrived on the river Danube in Bavaria. He left the Dutch contingent of his army in Flanders to pin down the French, then marched nearly 500 miles up the river Rhine towards Bavaria. The French had to keep a large number of their troops in Flanders, as Marlborough had taken with him a quantity of rivercraft which would enable him to turn around and sail down the Rhine back to Flanders much quicker than any pursuing French army could do on foot. He also planned the march meticulously, even providing his entire army with fresh pairs of boots along the way. This gives you some idea of what a master of logistics Churchill was, and in the following battle his newly trained and equipped troops would outfight and outfire the enemy on all fronts. Churchill had overseen his infantry's training himself and understood the newfound importance of the flintlock musket, which was more reliable than the older matchlock musket, and his troops were also well equipped with the ring bayonet, which was attached to the rifle around the barrel, rather than the plug bayonet which had to be pushed into the barrel of the rifle itself, meaning it could not be fired until the bayonet was taken out. He also taught his infantry how to fight an offensive battle, as it was commonplace for wars of the time to involve armies simply besieging one another in cities rather than pitched battles, which were rare. Marlborough broke with every convention of the time, continually outthinking the opposition and outfoxing them at every turn. Napoleon is often credited by many historians as being one of the commanders who first fully utilised an army's mobility on the campaign map, but the Duke of Marlborough was doing this nearly 100 years before Napoleon. After reaching the Danube, Churchill tried unsuccessfully to force the Bavarians to join the Allies by ransacking the local area, but the Bavarian Elector Maximilian Emmanuel stalled for a time as he knew there were French reinforcements on the way under Marshal Tallard. The French and Bavarians then joined forces, and the two armies then met near the small village of Blindheim, or Blenheim in English, on the 13th of August 1704. The French, who numbered in the region of 56,000 troops, took up a defensive position, with their line being anchored by the village of Blenheim on their right, and the village of Lutzingen on the left, which was largely occupied by the Bavarians, and the centre of the French line was positioned in the village of Oberlau. Marlborough first attacked the French right, moving troops to assault their positions within Blenheim, then moving more troops to attack the French centre around Oberlau. He then sent his right flank to attack the Bavarians around Lutzingen, which pinned the French and Bavarians down within each village, meaning Marlborough was now free to seek a breakthrough elsewhere. Having engaged the three most strongly held French and Bavarian positions around the villages, Churchill then moved more troops into Blenheim, resulting in Marshal Tallard weakening his centre to pile more troops into the village to defend it, leaving their centre exposed and vulnerable. Marlborough then sent the main body of his remaining forces to attack the French between the villages of Blenheim and Oberlau, and eventually the French buckled under the pressure, enabling Churchill to drive a wedge between the French and Bavarians, eventually resulting in a full-scale rout, which left the French troops in Blenheim effectively surrounded. Marshal Tallard himself was captured after the battle, which ended in the French and their allies suffering nearly 38,000 casualties, which was 2/3 of their entire force. Marlborough's victory at Blenheim prevented the French from defeating Austria and also forced them onto the back foot, and Bavaria was also knocked out of the war, leaving France virtually alone to fight against a coalition. Queen Anne lavished praise on Marlborough for his victory at Blenheim and gifted him the royal manor at Woodstock, Oxfordshire, which was to be rebuilt as a palace named after his victory. In 1706, the hitherto separate nations of England and Scotland were joined together in the Act of Union, which saw the Scottish Parliament vote effectively for its own termination. The Scottish and English crown had been held by the same monarch since the Stuarts had ascended to the English throne, after Queen Elizabeth I had died, leaving no heirs. The two countries' flags were also combined after the Act of Union into the famous Union flag, and the joining together of the two countries is still a topic of fierce patriotic debate in both England and Scotland to this very day. The Allies now attempted to invade France following the Battle of Blenheim, as they sensed that the country was weakened, but were prevented from doing so both by effective French resistance and Allied bungling. The French then went on the offensive, as Louis was determined to claim a favourable peace. The conflict now had spread further across Europe and the rest of the world, including North America, as Britain vied with the French for control over the continent. Indeed, it could be said that the War of the Spanish Succession, as it became known, was in fact the first truly global conflict. In 1706, Louis XIV sought revenge against Marlborough and Britain for the Battle of Blenheim, and ordered his Marshal Valois to bring this about. The French and Allied forces then met on the 23rd of May in the Spanish Netherlands near the Melhague River in modern-day Belgium. The resulting Battle of Ramillies would prove to be another great victory for Marlborough, arguably his greatest. The French battle line stretched around the Allied line in an arc, meaning that Marlborough had a smaller distance to cover to stay in touch with both his left and right flanks. The French and their allies could not see either of their flanks from the centre of the battlefield, making communication more time-consuming and difficult. In the centre of the field there was firm high ground, which Churchill realised was ideal for cavalry, whilst the flanks of the battlefield were lower marshy areas, in which Marlborough placed the main body of his infantry. Like at the Battle of Blenheim, at 1400 hours Marlborough attacked the enemy on their flanks, sending his Dutch infantry to assault the French on their right, and all of his British infantry to harass the French left. But these attacks were a mere diversion which Marshal Valois fell for hook, line and sinker. The French commander then moved troops to the flanks, thusly weakening his centre on the firm high ground, leaving it highly vulnerable to the thousands of Allied cavalry which opposed them. Churchill then, using the shorter distance between his flanks, ordered all of his Dutch cavalry on his right to reinforce his main cavalry force in the centre. This move was obscured from the French by the terrain, and what followed was the largest accurately recorded cavalry charge and battle ever seen in warfare up until that time, consisting of nearly 25,000 horsemen on both sides, charging and counter-charging each other for several hours. Marlborough himself was in the thick of the fighting, and at one point his equerry had his head blown off by a cannonball. Eventually, over the coming hours, the French right gave way under the relentless Allied pressure, resulting in another defeat for them. They lost nearly 15,000 casualties, whilst Marlborough's forces only lost just over 1,000 men. Over the coming years, the tide of the war more and more favoured the Allies, and Marlborough secured another victory over the French at the Battle of Oudenarde, which was a tactical victory rather than a numerical one, as the majority of the 80,000 strong French army was able to withdraw afterwards. The Allies then besieged and took Lille in 1708, which was one of the most strongly fortified cities on the continent, meaning that the French now seemed to be on the verge of collapse. There had been a strong possibility of a peace treaty between the two sides, but the Allies, buoyed by Marlborough's successes, had got greedy and attempted to force harsh peace terms on Louis XIV, which he rejected, resulting in a resurgence in French zeal, as they were now effectively fighting on their own soil. Marlborough then led the Allies towards Mons in 1709, but King Louis ordered Marshal Valois to defend the city at all costs. This resulted in the bloodiest battle of the war, Malplaquet, in which 85,000 Allies faced off against 75,000 French. The outcome of the battle was a slaughter on both sides, Marlborough's forces losing nearly 25,000 dead, wounded, missing or captured, whilst the French only lost half that number. Although the Allies forced the French to withdraw after the Battle of Malplaquet, the cost of the confrontation was too high, which took the wind out of the Allies' sails, and the Tories within the English Parliament now started agitating for Britain to withdraw from the alliance altogether. Peace negotiations then started between the two sides, and the War of the Spanish Succession finally came to an end with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Marlborough had misgivings about the peace treaty, as he felt that if France was not reduced or shackled as a major power, then the wars of his generation would come back to haunt subsequent generations to come. But such as with World War I, the cost of the war for both sides in terms of money and manpower had been huge, making a continuation of hostilities undesirable, if not impossible. Indeed, the War of the Spanish Succession and the Napoleonic Wars do have parallels with World War I and World War II. As with the War of the Spanish Succession and World War I, the Allies' enemies were not completely defeated and occupied, resulting years later in both cases with them having to fight again in the two largest and most costly wars of their respective ages against Napoleon and Adolf Hitler. Marlborough had emerged from the conflict with international fame and honours, and had shown his brilliance in the field of battle. He then spent the next few years touring Europe and earning and reaping the praise and gratitude of Britain's allies, until he was compelled to return home after news reached him of Queen Anne's failing health. On the very same day he landed in England, on the 1st of August 1714, Queen Anne died, and Marlborough then helped oversee the process by which Elector George of Hanover was invited and installed as King George I in August 1714. Over the coming years, Marlborough rightly received the acclaim and praise he deserved, and also oversaw the defeat of the 1715 Jacobite rebellion from London, which culminated in a British government victory. But the Duke's health steadily declined, and after a series of strokes, Sir John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, died on the morning of the 16th of June 1722, surrounded by his wife and surviving daughters, and he was then laid to rest in the family chapel at Blenheim Palace. Sadly, the Duke of Marlborough on the whole is an unknown figure amongst the general public in Britain today, but he is widely recognised amongst historians and military experts as the country's greatest military commander. Even the Duke of Wellington himself commented that he could not conceive anything greater than Marlborough at the head of an English army. Sir John Churchill stands today as one of the most important figures of the 1700s, as without him it is highly probable that Louis XIV's France would have dominated Europe and maybe the world, possibly even threatening English democracy, which today is the basis of all successful democracies throughout the world. His massive ambition and drive was matched by his skill at diplomacy, at logistics, at strategy and at tactics, and like his great descendant Sir Winston Churchill, he saved Britain, Europe and maybe the world from a future dominated by the tyranny and oppression of the greatest dictator of his age.